Welcome to the Drake Group's webinar series on critical issues in collegiate athletics. Today's discussion, brain trauma. Are we doing enough to protect college athletes? Our moderator is Katie Lever, doctoral candidate at the University of Texas, Austin, where her research focuses on college sports reform.
On behalf of the Drake Group, I'd like to thank everybody for coming to today's webinar. The Drake Group is an academic think tank working to better educate Congress, higher education leaders, and athletics administrators about critical issues in collegiate athletics. I'd also like to thank the University of Texas Center for Sport Media and Communication for providing a quiet space for me to conduct today's webinar, the topic of which is brain trauma. I'm very excited to talk to our panelists today about important topics about brain trauma and concussions, including sex differences in recovery, what exactly is a concussion, rules regarding contact practices, sufficiency of insurance coverage, and more, all through the lens of answering the question, are we doing enough? I'm very honored to introduce the panelists who are being asked to confront this important issue today. First off, we have Dr. Samantha Bureau. She is the Director of Programs at the Concussion Legacy Foundation, former Assistant Executive Director and Senior Director of International Research at the Concussion Legacy Foundation Canada, and a former NCAA ice hockey and track athlete. Thank you for joining us today, Samantha. Up next, we have Dr. Christian Dotson-Pearson. She is the co-author of CTE, Media, and the NFL, Framing a Public Health Crisis as a Football Epidemic, expert on grassroots efforts at concussion legislation, and a contributing author to American Sport in the Shadow of a Pandemic, Communicative Insights. Thank you so much, Christian, for being here today. And finally, we have Annie Welch, who is a Division I soccer player at Yale University, where she is pursuing a degree in architecture. Annie suffered a major concussion during the off-season after her freshman year, medically withdrew and took a semester off from her studies, and she's going to tell us more about her experiences today. She's also a former intern and a current freelancer at twoadays.com. Thank you, Annie, for joining us as well. So I want to start off just by establishing sort of a basic definition, some basic information about what a concussion is. I was wondering, Samantha, if you could answer that question for us.
Yeah, of course. So concussion is a type of traumatic brain injury. I feel like we get all these different terms tossed around. So concussion is just a type of brain injury, and it's caused by either a direct hit to the head or a hit to the body that causes your head to move back and forth rapidly. So your brain is floating in your skull. It's attached by your brainstem. So when you do have that rapid movement of your head, your brain is moving in your skull, and this causes the tissue to stretch, which can damage your brain cells, which means they're not able to function properly. And then that's why you experience a variety of symptoms, right? So your physical ones, maybe cognitive issues, emotional symptoms, issues with sleep. And that's kind of an indicator that there is some damage there that you should get checked out.
Yeah, and thank you for that. And another term I hear thrown around a lot when we talk about concussions, brain trauma, and head injuries is CTE. I was wondering, especially in light of the Tua Tagovailoa injury, Samantha, if you could tell us a little bit more about CTE and your paper that talked about the Tua injury.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So CTE is stands for chronic traumatic encephalopathy. So it's a neurodegenerative disease. So there's a lot of misconceptions around the role of concussion and CTE. So just to, I guess, set the record straight and be very clear, there's no evidence that shows concussions are directly related to CTE. It's repetitive head impacts or repetitive brain injuries. So if you've had one concussion, that does not necessarily mean that you are at risk for getting CTE. But if you have had, hundreds or thousands of impacts over the course of your career, some maybe were concussions, some maybe weren't, that is really what puts you at risk. So it is a disease that's similar to, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, in the sense that it is a progressive disease that happens over a period of time in your brain. The cells in your brain are dying off. They're not functioning properly because there's a buildup of protein that is abnormal in your brain. And right now we cannot treat it and we cannot diagnose it in life. So it is pretty serious. But getting to the paper, so earlier in July, we had published a paper about the causation of CTE. So for many people in the field, we have all, acknowledged that the repetitive brain trauma is the cause of this disease. But many governing bodies in sports and other people in the field feel that it is just a relationship and it's not causal, there's not enough evidence. So we went through all the literature to date and looked at it through an epidemiological framework that was used to prove smoking causes lung cancer. So we looked at all the evidence, and we were able to show that across all 9 criteria we looked at, there was sufficient evidence to show that repetitive brain trauma is the cause of this disease, and then really outline what this means for sporting leagues. So what is the liability? Should there be, an onus on these leagues to acknowledge this and show their players that they are taking their health seriously? And of course, as we saw a couple weeks ago with the Tua injury, that is a case of a concussion protocol issue, which I'm sure we will get into later. But that injury just kind of goes to show that there are many things that maybe are not happening optimally in these leagues that need to be done to keep athletes safe.
Oh, yes, we're definitely going to get to concussion protocols and what leagues are and are not doing today. While we're talking about CTE and the media, it feels like a really good place to ask Christian a little bit about your book on CTE and how the media frames it. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, so with the book that I was able to co-author with a couple of my colleagues down at USF, we thought it was important to really look at how not just broadcast media, but print media are also looking at this issue. A lot of times you'll hear the same language: he got his bell rung, he's knocked out, he's blacked out. But we really wanted to kind of understand, what is it that they're really trying to say? And what we found is that a lot of times they may use this terminology, but not take the opportunity to educate the audience on what it truly means. And so there is room for growth in that area, perhaps having someone who is familiar with the terminology or with the symptoms and concussions and kind of what happens and what to look for, having someone just kind of offer them a little bit of insight to explain that to the viewing public is something that would allow people who may not know what a concussion is or just how severe an injury can be to fully understand it. So print journalists taking time to use part of their story to thoroughly explain and give examples. If you're on TV, a little less time that you have to explain these issues, but still taking the opportunity that you do have to really touch base on it would be better than just saying he got his bell rung and then attempting to speculate, because that then leads to other issues that people don't know how to go. We saw with Tua's injury when he did perhaps have a case of the second impact syndrome, how his fingers and everything kind of twisted as a reaction. People weren't sure what that was. So if there had been someone to train the broadcasters or even just be in a booth with them just to explain, hey, this is what's going on, that would help kind of ease or at least allow people to better understand what was taking place in real time.
Can you also tell us a bit more about the role of grassroots organizations in spreading awareness about concussions and concussions symptoms? I remember you mentioned that in our emails, and I'm curious to hear more.
So my dissertation actually did focus on the efforts of grassroots organizations in regards to advocating for concussion awareness. And strangely enough, I wanted to do this topic after looking up the name of a course at a completely different institution. So when I saw media advocacy, I saw it as an opportunity to really just kind of go in and really examine what is going on with sports, especially concussions. Every time there's football, we always have this idea of how many concussions players may experience that season. There's studies that have shown that. And so with doing this, I really wanted to see how people that are connected to not professional athletes, but youth athletes, amateur athletes, those in high school, how are they preparing not just the students, but the parents of these athletes to identify what is a concussion, what is the proper way to recover if their child does suffer concussion. But more importantly, what I did find out through my research was that a lot of times athletes don't want to speak up. They're afraid of losing their place on the field. They're afraid of being looked at as weak. And that goes to a larger narrative as it relates to this idea of being masculine if you're playing football, or not expressing emotion if you are a guy playing a sport. So these grassroots efforts are really focused on not just educating about the symptoms of concussions, but also making sure that the athletes have agency and have a voice to really do what they need to do to protect themselves from long-term injuries from the concussion they may sustain.
Yeah, thank you for that. So Annie, in talking about agency that athletes have and taking those steps to protect yourself, why don't you talk to us a little bit about your concussion experience and what recovery has been like for you and what you've been doing to take care of yourself?
Absolutely. So I suffered my concussion in the spring of last semester. So I pretty much was starting the off season and was excited for the season ahead. First practice back, I get hit in the head and I'm out for about 9 months now. It's been a really major injury. I was suffering from headaches pretty much on a constant basis. It was debilitating, to be quite honest. I wasn't able to go to practice to see my team, to participate. I wasn't able to go to class because of light sensitivity, noise sensitivity, and all the other symptoms that come along with concussions just pretty much took away all of my capability. So this was obviously, as you can imagine, a very draining experience, very isolating as well. So I also had some mental health factors that went into my decision. Then I kind of decided to drop a few classes to see if I could manage a smaller workload, but still, my cognitive functioning was not at the same level as it was before the concussion. So I, through conversations with my parents and my dean, I made the decision to medically withdraw from my semester at Yale. And, that decision as a young student athlete is quite difficult. Giving up not only like the sport you love, having to go home like from your friends, from your place that you've just started to settle down in, and having to drop all your classes. It's a lot to face as a young adult. So I made that decision, decided to go home because I knew it was best for my health and for my recovery, because it took all of the stressors that were causing my symptoms off of my plate. It can kind of give me more of a space where I could control my healing process and really build a team around me that I needed for support at that time. When I got home, I was seeing a vestibular therapist pretty much right away, working on, eye movement, just kind of giving my neck mobility back. I was working with chiropractic. I was working with psychiatrists and psychiatric help. I pretty much went down every route I could to get healed from this concussion. And what led to the most significant improvement for me was definitely vestibular therapy. And that I give that a lot of credit for why I was able to recover in the time I was able to. If I didn't have all those resources that I had during my medical leave, I would not be back here this semester one summer later. So I'm really thankful for my medical leave and all those supporting me.
Yeah, I'm sure. Can you tell us a bit more about medical leave, what it is specifically, and or how college athletes can take advantage of it?
Absolutely. So upon, getting severely injured like I was, they kind of give you your options. They lay them out to you after you see the doctor. They tell you you can try to hang in there, stick with your classes, and do your best. Obviously, depending on the injury, it's gonna be easier or harder. For me, it being a head injury, that made classes nearly impossible for me to continue with. So eventually I made the decision that I was too far behind in my courses to really be taking advantage of the educational experience I was trying to get it at Yale. So I had a conversation with my dean about leaving for the rest of the semester, and pretty much all you have to do to start the medical leave process is put down in writing that that's your intention to leave for the rest of the semester, and they pretty much handle the process from there. You just got to pack up all your stuff and leave pretty much from there. So there's just a little bit of paperwork involved, and the reinstatement is honestly where you're going to have to do more work, because you're going to have to prove that you're healthy enough to come back and to handle the workload and the athletic environment.
Yeah, I can only imagine that head injuries complicate that entire process. And it's interesting too, because I think when a lot of people think about concussions, brain trauma, CTE, all of this stuff, they tend to think about football players. But, Annie can attest that this is an issue for any athlete in any kind of sport that involves contact. I was just saying before the webinar, I was a distance runner in college, and I didn't have to deal with any of this. And that was one of the reasons that I was like, oh, I should probably take up running. But for athletes across all kinds of contact sports, brain trauma can be a significant issue. And it's also an issue for female athletes that's often very much overlooked. And Christian, I wanted to take that opportunity to ask you if you could talk about how concussions and brain injuries manifest differently in men versus women.
Yeah, so a lot of the times the symptoms will generally be along the same lines in terms of, as Annie was saying, the sensitivity to light. It's difficult to be in a room with brightness. So like even my space now, the light coming through the windows would be too much if I had a concussion because it's just very bright. Aside from the symptoms such as the sensitivity and it being difficult to really kind of engage with others and be in environments, one thing that is difficult to really discern is what happens after the concussion symptoms start to subside as it relates to female athletes. There's actually not a lot of research as to how female athletes are impacted. It focuses mostly on males and what happens when they are going through the recovery process. But when it comes to looking at women and girls, there's not that much research. There are suggestions that say that girls shouldn't be able to head in soccer before they're 12. But aside from actually discussing, okay, if a woman has a concussion, here's what happens to her versus what happens to a guy, how a guy may be able to recover faster because their necks are stronger if it is a heading injury, or if it's something for a woman where she does sustain a concussion, maybe not from soccer, but from cheerleading and being dropped on her head. We truly don't know just how much to an extent it takes them to recover. It's not studied enough. It definitely is something that needs to be reviewed more. It's an opportunity for scholars to kind of take that, maybe find a group of women athletes across the board, whether they're amateur, professional, and really talk to them to understand what happened. When I was doing my research, and I'll actually read one of the quotes that the participants gave to me because I do think it helps to kind of underscore the difficulty that they face. And so one participant was discussing how their loved one, I believe it was their daughter perhaps, went through a concussion, and they said the sensitivity to light, sensitivity to noise, balance issues. They didn't have cognitive issues, but they were fuzzy. But the issue was they still weren't able to recover even after a couple of weeks, and they didn't have anything that severe. But then the other issues came about where they couldn't get cleared to play any summer sports or travel sports because they couldn't get cleared. They still couldn't get cleared for fall activities. So anything that they played, they weren't able to do. And again, they didn't have any other cognitive issues, just the light sensitivity. And so all the sports, volleyball, the field hockey, they weren't able to play. It was her favorite sport. And then before softball season came, that's when she got cleared. So we're talking about 9-10 months before they could play. But by the time she was ready to go back, she had lost her skill set. So even just reading that kind of take on how it was to care for someone, care for a loved one who experienced it, we can see that even something that didn't require a lot of recovery, since it was just a couple of weeks, they lost almost a full year and then lost their skill set. So again, looking at what it does for women versus men, there's still a lot that can be done, but that's just kind of one insider's take on what it was like for their experience caring for their daughter, who really couldn't do what she loved to do because of the one concussion that she suffered.
Yeah, and this is not only a problem that affects athletes at the professional and the collegiate level, but Christian, it also affects youth athletes as well. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes, so there was, I believe this happened in 2012. I could be wrong on the year, but there was a student in Oregon who actually suffered a concussion, but it was a debilitating concussion. And so much so that they actually came up with the Zach Lydstead law, and they really wanted the school system to figure out what is going to be their approach to taking care of student athletes if they are injured. This student wasn't able to return to anything that they love to do. The concussion was that bad. It was during a football game. They had to be taken off the field, and their parents were just upset at the fact that they had not been made aware of any type of concussion protocols that existed. This opens the door for states to actually figure out what is the best approach to dealing with high school athletes in particular, because you do want protocols in place, but really trying to figure out, is there room for a school if a state, for example, does not want to pass a law? Can schools themselves or district themselves use this as an opportunity to protect the student athletes? Given what I found, and given just the current kind of ways in which schools with funding per se, a lot of schools don't have nurses on hand. So if you don't have a nurse on hand to take care of just I have a cold, I think I fell and scraped my knee, or I have a minor injury, how do you expect schools to have fully staffed physicians or a full staff of doctors that can offer this insight? So if schools don't have resources that would allow them to hire the proper medical professionals to help with determining if someone has suffered a concussion or a head injury of any kind, how then are we supposed to protect youth athletes? It is shown that actually girls soccer and cheerleading have the highest incidences of injury, from either being on a pyramid if you're in cheerleading to the headers that you experience in soccer over their male counterparts. And yet we don't really have much protection in place that we can extend to make sure if this happens, this is what needs to be done. So I do think that's something that we can take a little more look at and try to figure out how to make it fair for youth athletes, because they're the youngest and they really can't protect themselves if they don't know that they can, or what to do, or what to even say, if they feel like they're putting themselves in danger by continuing to play through injury.
Yeah, thank you for that. So concussions can affect athletes of all sports, men and women, multiple levels of participation. Sam, I'm wondering if there are any athletes in particular who are susceptible to concussions. And I'd also like to hear a bit about your work with the Concussion Legacy Foundation.
Yeah, so the thing with concussion and any brain injury is they're so individual. Two people could have the exact same force of impact, direction, angle, all of that, but have two completely different outcomes. One could recover very quickly, and one could recover over the course of months or years. But the one thing when you think about susceptibility to concussion is also your exposure. So the more exposure you have to getting hit in the head, your risk is going to increase. That kind of puts us in the contact sport athletes. But again, thinking about contact sports, it's not just your football, your hockey, lacrosse. You have to also think again about soccer, where you're heading the ball. And interestingly, in soccer, about a third of the concussions that happen in soccer happen when two players go to try to head the ball, and they either are colliding or they're hitting the ground and hitting their head. So very high risk activity, and it's a sport that most people don't necessarily consider to be contact. And of course, the female game, in most cases, the sport is modified, but it doesn't mean it's not contact. It's just maybe no body checking in hockey, but there's still quite a lot of contact. So it's something to think about. It's more about how many times you're putting yourself at risk, which will indicate your exposure and your risk. But then also from a male-female standpoint, again, the research is limited. But the research that is coming out does suggest that women, for whatever reasons, the recovery is not always as speedy as men, or maybe their symptoms are a bit more debilitating at the beginning, or more mental health symptoms. So we do need to dive into that deeper, but there does seem to be a suggestion that there is differences between the sexes. In terms of the Concussion Legacy Foundation, we are a nonprofit. We're based here in the US, but we have chapters in Canada, the UK, and Australia that we launched earlier this year. And we basically came about to provide education, awareness for anyone who could be impacted by brain injury. So whether that is athletes, veterans, individuals who have, a history of domestic violence in their household, anyone who may be susceptible to a brain injury, we're here for you. So we offer a wide range of education. So whether it be education for athletes about actually learning to speak up when their teammate may be suffering from an injury, we have a program for that. We also have a program to train media broadcasters and print journalists about how to report on concussions properly, so that we can be educating the public. And then we have our patient and family services division, where that is really our helpline, our support groups, like the actual tangible things that we can be doing to help people and their caregivers while they're going through these experiences. But what we're really deeply rooted in is in research. So we have worked with the Boston University CT Center. We have a global brain bank network. So we work with brain banks all over the world to study the effects of brain injury. And then we just really amplify that messaging to the public. So thinking about the Aaron Hernandez case, or any of the cases that have come out recently that you're hearing in the news, we are working with those research teams to get consents from the family to share those results publicly, so that the general public can be aware that this is an issue and it's ongoing and we have a long way to go.
Yeah, so we've got some good work that everyone on this panel is doing. We've got research and advocacy efforts all around. But now I'm wondering about sports leagues, whether it's professional leagues or the NCAA, or even like we were discussing high schools and those athletic organizations. Are they doing enough to protect athletes from concussions and the risks associated with them? I'd like to ask all of the panelists that question, starting off with Christian.
So in all honesty, I don't think leagues are doing enough. I believe that they are more reactive rather than proactive. They have opportunities to use their social media platforms to give the message well in advance of someone sustaining an injury. I do believe that they need to take the time, either midway during a season, after the season. At some point, they need to reevaluate their protocols and not wait until we see what happened with Tua, the effects of that injury, or Ryan Shazier when he had his injury a few years ago. We shouldn't wait until there's already an injury happening. It should always be ongoing conversations. How can we use our platforms to educate our audience? How can we use the high profile players in our league to give information? I think if they try to do an edutainment type of approach where they take opportunities and either craft commercials or have a show, or if they did even if they had just a town hall of some kind or a panel, I think that would be more useful, so that not only are they being held accountable for what they aren't doing, the public is aware, and again, not having to speculate as to who's in charge, what's going on, but really just using what they have at their disposal. Social media, honestly, being one of the best ways, and then just working in conjunction with organizations that do the work so that they can have a message that's cohesive and also allows us to understand that they do take this seriously and not see it as our money's at risk or we're going to lose fans because we're just now trying to do something, but we've had opportunities to do so well in advance of injuries or life-threatening injuries in this instance.
What do you think, Samantha?
Yeah, I would agree. I don't think there's enough being done. I think if you look at just the wide range of brain injury that is involved in sports, so anywhere from your concussion, which you will call your acute injury, moving into post-concussion syndrome, which, Annie unfortunately suffered with her prolonged symptoms, and then looking at the long-term effects with CTE. Again, there's issues with protocols. Someone like the NCAA actually does not have one overarching protocol. They actually just provide suggestions to the member schools, and then the member schools are responsible for creating their own protocols. So then there's an issue there with I guess the universal nature of it, how it can be enforced if not everyone is using the same protocol. But also right now, the NFL is the only governing body that accepts that repetitive head impacts causes CTE. So it's very difficult to move forward in these conversations if hardly any governing bodies in the world of this billion-dollar industry are even accepting the fact that there are very serious long-term implications. And I mean, I was a college athlete, I played a contact sport, love sports. At the foundation, almost all of us were contact athletes, and we want kids to keep playing sports. There's just a way where they can be playing sports safer. So what we advocate for is actually eliminating head impacts before the age of 14. So basically removing that until they're in the high school level, only so that you are cutting down their total exposure, because then the risk of them getting a neurodegenerative disease later in life goes down drastically, but they can still play their sport. Like if you look at hockey, they've done a pretty good job where there's not body checking until the U13 or U14 level, depending on your region. But kids can still grow up and go and play professionally and do a really good job because you can learn those basic skills of the sport without having to hit your head over and over again. So that's something to think about. In the UK, they banned heading in soccer under the age of 12 recently. So all these little things we can do to keep kids still playing sports. And then when they get to the college level, making sure we have those protocols in place. So if kids are getting injured, there's a safeguard for them so that we can get them the right care they need. And hopefully they're not suffering from prolonged symptoms.
And just as a follow-up question for you, what do general concussion protocols look like in the NCAA?
Yeah, so that's the thing, they do vary, but if you're looking at your very basic protocol that most researchers at least promote, it's usually a stage system, right? So they're looking at a series of stages that an athlete must pass to clear. And the reason they do this is typically when you have symptoms, your injury is still ongoing, but there's even times when you can be asymptomatic, but your brain is not fully healed. So the reason we have the staging system is that it gives you that bit of a buffer time. But typically what you would have is at the beginning, you have these signs that people need to be looking out for. So whether just taking the Tua injury, he grabbed his head, he was stumbling, he was off balance. Both of these are signs of a concussion that should trigger someone going into a protocol, which means they're then getting checked out by a physician who is trained to evaluate, his symptoms and his risk. But once you're in that protocol, even if the physician says, you know what, I think you're fine, you don't get to leave the protocol. And that's the key. So typically the first 24 hours is rest. It's not recommended anymore for extended rest in a dark room. That was, a very popular treatment method back in the day. And we've since learned that light aerobic activities, so things like walking, maybe biking on low resistance, can actually be really good for recovery. But at the beginning, it's important that they get rest. If they are showing no symptoms, you move them into that light aerobic activity where you're only pushing yourself to the limit of maybe having light symptoms. Hopefully it's no symptoms. And then you can progress forward into modified practices, full practice without any limitations, and then finally into a game. So in a perfect world, this protocol, if you have no symptoms after they check you out, would still take you 5 or so days to fully clear. And the reason they do this is because, again, your brain, just because you're asymptomatic doesn't mean your brain is fully healed, and it just reduces your risk of, devastating injury like second impact syndrome, which was mentioned earlier, which again is rare, but something to keep in mind. And we've seen it in the youth game where someone has concussion, they go back in, they get hit again, and unfortunately they pass away because their brain is swelling, and you can't recover. So that's something you don't want any family to have to go through. After working with a couple families who went through that for their child, they really wish that they would have known to just keep their kid out of the game than to push them and go back.
Yeah, thank you so much for that insight. It's interesting to hear that in light of the Tua Tagovailoa hit. That one has been on my mind very, very consistently ever since it happened. And Annie, I'd like to throw that question out to you about what we were just talking about a minute ago about what universities and the NCAA can do to help athletes who sustain concussions.
I would definitely have to agree with Sam and Christian on the response that the NCAA and governing bodies can absolutely be doing more to advocate for concussion reduction and just general raising awareness for concussions and the steps that one needs to take after being hit in the head and suffering potential injury. I do, speaking from my experience as a current Division I athlete, I do know that they do some education for the athletes themselves, but there's definitely room to advocate publicly about concussion reduction and injury reduction in general. I can only really speak for the Ivy League when I'm talking about the protocol we have in place. We do concussion testing before season, during season if you're injured. We have our trainers on hand, and we pretty much go through that exact process that Sam was just outlining for you guys, the 5-step process to dealing with a concussion. So there's definitely a lot of loops that athletes themselves have to jump through after getting hit in the head. But like what is lacking, like both of them have already mentioned, is just the general public advocacy for concussed athletes, for injured athletes, and dealing with the after effects and how to correctly heal from a brain injury.
And Annie, what advice would you have for fellow athletes who experience concussions during their college careers?
I would definitely advise them to take it slow. That was one thing, that can be hard for athletes, especially because you don't want to be kept out of your sport. You want to be with your team, you want to be playing. But your brain is obviously vital to life and all your daily functioning. So if you don't take that seriously, your recovery seriously, you can be really suffering long term. Had I not taken the steps that I took right away after my concussion, I just would, I'd be concerned for where I would be today if I had not taken my brain injury seriously. So definitely want to be communicating openly and honestly with trainers, because I know that can be hard at times. You don't want to get kept out. Be up front with your coach. Know all of your resources is definitely the biggest thing. I had to discover all the resources for myself pretty much. I think one thing that schools can do a little bit better is outline the resources for concussed and injured athletes, give them access to student accessibility accommodations, give them access to mental health and counseling right away, give them access to physical therapist names and others that could help them through their process. I think that's a big thing, like just collecting all the resources into one place and giving that to the athletes would be like instrumental in athletes' recovery.
Yeah, so it sounds like to me there's a need for education, advocacy, uniformity across the league. So there's definitely a lot of work to be done. Are there any other best practices or suggestions that we haven't covered today? Because I think we have some power players in college sports listening in today. So I'd like to leave them with some practical things that they can do to protect athletes from concussions. Is there anything that we haven't covered, Christian?
So I was trying to glance through some of the notes that I have, and I think the one thing I really took away from what Annie was saying in particular is that schools have to be accountable for how they handle their student athletes. NCAA is big on plugging student athletes, and so student before the athlete. But if you have one of your student athletes who does suffer an injury and they then need resources, they should already have those readily available. So I think it's going to come down to finding a way to either add within each conference, if the NCAA as a whole doesn't want to do something at the conference level, having a plan in place. This is what we do when we have athletes with injuries. As soon as you know that one has one, this is the person that they go to, and let them work with that person or that team that can then help them to establish a plan on how to move forward. If we expect student athletes to give their all on the field, then when they are injured, the least that can be done for those behind the scenes is to make sure they have what they need in order to recover. And even with some of the participants I talked to in my dissertation study, I did speak to pediatricians, and even they were just saying when they have an opportunity to do so, they like to make sure that they're communicating face to face with parents and athletes and telling them, when in doubt, sit out, giving them the same cliches. And yes, they sound like, of course, I know that. But again, you'd be surprised by how many people don't. So I think giving the NCAA some structure, some type of organization, some way to really help student athletes recover so that they can then go back, if not to playing, at least come back to be a student that has their cognitive abilities and can feel comfortable being in a classroom. I think that is key. Without that knowledge, they're going to have their student athletes just kind of floating around and trying to figure it out. And that's not fair to them, because they came to the school hoping to play and they did, and they were injured. So now they need our help to recover and be back to their best self.
What do you think, Samantha?
I think one thing to keep in mind is, of course, at the collegiate level, like your record on the ice, field, track, whatever it is important. So looking at it from that perspective, pulling the health angle out, because we know a lot of people are resistant to doing things for your health. So if you look at it from a pure performance level, someone with a brain injury is not going to perform as well or better than someone without, even if they are your top player. If they have a brain injury, they will not be able to perform at the best level. So that is a liability for not only their health, but for your team from a performance standpoint, to have them to push through. So from a health standpoint, people shouldn't be pushing through. From a performance standpoint, they shouldn't either. And I'd really encourage people to think about, from a coaching standpoint, how can you reduce the risk of these injuries in practice? Your athlete spends the majority of their time in their season in practice, and that's where the most risk for injury is. We see a lot of injuries happening, in this situation. So there's a few teams, even the NCAA. So if you look at Dartmouth's football team, they do not hit in practice, right? A really great example of a team where they can still be, a strong squad, very competitive, but their coaches decided that it's not worth the risk to their player safety to be putting them through that, because they want them at peak shape for the game. And when I played on Thursdays, we did not do anything that was really contact. We were running through systems. We were only doing that sort of work so that we are fresh for games on Friday, Saturday, because in hockey you play back-to-back games every week and it's a very long season. So you need to be able to be fresh for all those games. So I would encourage people, if they are resistant to the health argument or whatever, for whatever reason, if you're looking at your team's performance, it's also in your best interest to be keeping those athletes out and doing what you can so they can get back to the field sooner rather than later.
And Annie, you had some great suggestions in your last answer. I just want to make sure that we're not leaving anything out.
Yeah, I definitely want to leave everyone just with the idea of that getting hit in the head and suffering from a concussion is also a mental health issue. It can be so isolating being a concussed athlete, not only from the classroom, but from your team, from your coaches, from your teammates, from your peers. It can be so isolating. And if you suffer a concussion, it is so important to reach out to mental health services and really start to process your injury and all that you're dealing with now, because recovery is so hard. Recovery is so challenging in so many ways. And it can feel so defeating to have your cognitive function just not be at where you want it to be, especially as like a high level athlete and as a student. So just the fact that it's a mental health issue, I think, is underrepresented in just all conversations about concussions in general. And I think that there needs to be an acknowledgement of that as well.
Yeah, it's so encouraging, for me to hear this next generation of athletes being so much more open about mental health. That's something that I did not experience when I was a college athlete. So it's always an encouraging sign for me to hear athletes embrace that mental health is health, and that it's just as important for athletes to take care of that as it is for them to take care of their physical health. And concussions sound like a little bit of both. And I'd like to thank the panelists once again for joining us today. You all have been just excellent and insightful, and I've learned a lot, and I'm still like processing, and I'll be chewing on this for days. But I do want to make sure that we can get to some Q&As from our audience. We have about 10 questions here. I'm going to try to get to all of them. If we don't, just like Becca said at the beginning of the webinar, we'll be sending out notes. So keep an eye on your inboxes for that if your question went unanswered. Annie, we have a question for you from an audience member. Alex asks, how was your experience dealing with coaches, teachers, and trainers throughout the concussion process?
I generally had really positive experiences with my administration and the coaching staff. They were very supportive of all the decisions I made in my healing process, but I certainly know that that is not a universal experience. A lot of coaches, if their star player gets hurt, they might place some pressure on that player to push through or continue to playing despite their injury. As well as you get that pressure from the academic side. There are some professors that are less than understanding about college athletics in general, as well as being an injured athlete. So it was definitely difficult to explain to them, I have a long-term injury. I'm not going to be at class for a long time. And to try to set up something with accommodations to get notes or something else to keep up with class was definitely very difficult to navigate. That's why, I'd suggest that students reach out to their school's student accessibility services in order to get those services that they need and that help that they need in the classroom. That experience, with coaches and administration and staff in mind can be very difficult to navigate, because all three of them, all three levels have different insights on what you should be doing as an athlete and as a student. So the expectations are definitely really high, and there's a lot of pressure that's put on the injured athlete. So I think that that's something that definitely can be improved in the future. Just generally compiling all the resources that a student athlete may need after their injury, as well as helping them find that support from all those resources.
Yeah, thank you for that, Annie. And we have a related question specifically about the role of coaches post-injury to make sure that the athlete is getting what they need from a recovery standpoint, including mental health issues that are a part of the symptoms of concussions. So Christian and Samantha, either of y'all can answer this one. What is that role of coaches to make sure that athletes are getting what they need in the recovery process?
I mean, I really look at the coach as kind of the gatekeeper. Like, they are usually the person putting pressure on the athlete to either come back, or they're the person who has the final say as to whether or not they're getting back on, the field of play. So that's really important for coaches to recognize that even if you're getting pressure from parents, or you feel like there's pressure from the team or other people to put that player back, at the end of the day, it is your team. And that's just a responsibility that you have. So you do have a lot of power there at your disposal to make sure that you're keeping athletes safe. But I think it's really important for coaches to be able to recognize the signs and symptoms, because usually you are the first point of contact. As someone who has coached before, I know there's usually a lot going on in the game, which is why having athletic trainers, and maybe you can train parents who are watching to be looking for these signs and symptoms to help you, because the sooner you can identify an athlete who may be injured and getting them to a physician to start that protocol is important. But I would really encourage that if you have any suspicion that there may be a brain injury, put them in the concussion protocol. Yes, this means they will miss a week at minimum, likely, of their sport, but missing a week now versus missing 9 to 10 months if you come back too early is probably a really good alternative for the athlete. They may not understand at the time, but I think later on they'll look back and appreciate what you have done. And as Annie alluded to, I think having resources at your disposal to provide to your players and their parents, whether it is education on what the injury is, how to find a physician, if there's support groups. Mental health is obviously very important, and a lot of the research is showing that especially at the youth level, children who suffered a concussion are 40% more likely to develop mental health issues following the injury, even if they have no history of mental health previously. So that's something to be aware of. And again, have those resources at your disposal, and just be really understanding if the athlete is not coming back. It is not because they don't want to play. I promise you, they probably want to be out there more than anything. It's because they really cannot do it, and just to respect that decision.
Yeah, that's always such a tricky part about any kind of injury in athletes is, they do want to get back on the field, in the pool, on the track. And so coach intervention can be very, very important there. What do you think, Christian?
So I was going to say, I do agree with everything that's been said, but also going back to a point that Annie had about teachers, I do think it's important that teachers also understand that even though that they may not like sports, agree with sports, follow sports, that's fine. But if you have someone coming to you to tell you that they are suffering from some type of head injury and it's going to impact their academic abilities, I think teachers then also have to take that responsibility in making sure that they are sensitive to that and understand that if you've had the same student in your class, they performed well as they were playing the sport, then they come to tell you that they're injured, that it obviously is something that is serious and not just something where they can sleep it off and in 2 days kind of come back to normal. So teachers do spend a lot of time with students in the classroom in terms of teaching and engaging. And so just allowing that student who tells you that they have to be out due to a concussion, instead of looking at it as come back tomorrow, come back in 2 days, really working with them and even taking time out. Hey, do you have what you need? What can I do to help? I don't know your sport. I may not know what you're going through, but how can I help you so that you can become better when you are able to return? So I just think allowing teachers having to have that same responsibility as coaches would also be critical to making sure both sides are equally aware of their roles and responsibilities for helping student athletes to recover.
And as far as the research on headgear, I was wondering if Christian or Samantha, if either of you have any insight on the role in protective headgear in preventing traumatic brain injuries.
Yeah, so I mean, helmets are really great at preventing, lacerations, like, cuts to your skin and bleeding. But when it comes to actually preventing brain injury, sure, there may be some helmets that, lessen the force slightly. But when you look back to the definition of a concussion, it is that rapid acceleration or deceleration of your brain and your skull, which is floating. So even if you're getting an impact and you have a helmet, is never going to fully prevent concussion. And if you actually look at the history, what is interesting is before we used to wear leather helmets in some of these sports, so people used to be a bit more careful about some of their techniques for tackling. And then you give people these super helmets and you're starting to see a lot of those head-on-head collisions. So it does beg the question on, are people feeling a bit too protected with this gear where they're comfortable leading with their head? But at the end of the day, the research has shown that a helmet is not going to prevent this from happening. And when you think about CTE risk, it is your cumulative impact, whether it was a concussion or not. So that unless you're actually reducing the number of hits you're taking, you're not going to see a reduction from that front either.
Yeah, Christian, do you have anything to add?
Just the one thing I noticed on the season of Hard Knocks with the Detroit Lions, I noticed that some of their players were wearing like the little mushroom padding on top of their helmet. And that was, from my understanding, when they were discussing it briefly in the show, was just a way for them to be able to tackle if they wanted to, but not really have the level of injury. But I just still thought, you still have a helmet, you still have padding, but you're still at risk either way. So I don't know if that was just meant to soften the blow, but as Samantha was saying, like a helmet is a helmet. It can only do so much. It's not going to stop a concussion from happening. So just keeping that in mind.
And then we've talked about, youth athletes, high school athletes, college athletes. We have a question in the chat from Drake Masters athlete Sandy Thatcher, who is a Masters swimmer, about the risk of concussions in Masters athletes who play sports like soccer, basketball, rugby, and other sports like that. He wants to know, does the risk and severity for concussions increase with age?
I don't know that there's been that much research looking specifically at age as a variable, but if you just think about your general risk for dementia, neurodegenerative disease in general, you see that increasing with age because unfortunately, you have one brain, and as you age, you're losing some of these neurons. So as you could imagine, having a brain injury later in life, it would be reasonable to suspect that it may be a bit more difficult to recover just because your brain is already starting to prune some of those connections that you've made through life. But again, there's not a ton of research that's looking at this specifically across age as a variable, but you do have to think that your risk for other brain-related diseases and disorders is increasing with your age.
And then the last question that we have in the chat that we're going to get to today is it's about football and like we mentioned earlier how the NFL does acknowledge that that football does cause brain trauma, CTE, all of that. So we have this knowledge at hand. We know that repetitive hits to the head are not good. We know that football not necessarily encourages head-to-head contact, but as a result of the game, those sorts of things do happen. So one of our audience members asks in that light, is it time to punt on tackle football? Why don't we start with
Yeah, I think that line of inquiry just goes back to, I think, what I've been saying throughout. So I apologize if I haven't been clear, but when I'm talking about repetitive head impacts, that is very much talking about the subconcussive head impacts, not just concussion. So CTE risk, again, is from, a mix of subconcussive and any impacts that did cause a brain injury with observable symptoms. And what we really do at the foundation is we're advocating to remove any exposure before the age of 14 at a minimum. We understand that there's a lot of people that love football. For me personally, it's not a favorite sport of mine anymore after just working directly with these athletes later on and just seeing what they go through. but we're really big advocates for flag football. So it's something where I played touch football growing up. I know a lot of people who played flag. Still a great game. You're reducing the impact substantially. So just looking at ways we can modify sports to reduce, again, that cumulative exposure, because if you can reduce, the risk that kids get, say, from the age 5 to 14, you're pulling, 9 years of impacts off their career, which is going to substantially reduce your risk of developing CTE. And all the research to date shows that usually you need about 5 years at minimum of, exposure to repetitive hit impacts to typically get CTE. That's a cutoff that is used for a lot of the diagnostic tools that they are testing. So looking at ways to reduce someone's lifespan for this, it's easier to do that at the youth level than to pull people out of the college or professional game.
Christian, what are your thoughts?
So I would say I agree. I don't think you necessarily need to get rid of tackle football, but really just, as Sam was saying, make everyone aware that youth between 5 and 14, as she said, really should not have as much contact. If you want to have them play tackle football, teach them the proper ways to do so. Not necessarily take out someone's legs because they still need those, but also not being quick to handle or give that big blow that's going to actually knock someone out. And then even looking beyond football, because you still have soccer, you still have people who want to either take up boxing or may box currently, even looking at cheerleading, just looking at all the sports that are either contact or maybe not considered contact, just really thinking about ways that you can change how you approach teaching or coaching the sport, and then offering alternatives, but also letting them know this is not going to change your ability to run or catch or pass a ball or anything along those lines. We just want to make sure that we're taking steps now so that you aren't like Aaron Hernandez, who was diagnosed with a very high level stage of CTE, realizing that all these hits, everything that went on, could have been prevented if someone had just taken the time to actually help them and allow them to protect themselves. So just stepping in, letting them know you may not like it now, but I can promise you when you're older, you'll be thankful that you didn't have those 9 years of hits and you actually may have extended your career even an extra 2 or 3 years. Because if you think about it, when Chris Borland retired from the Niners, he was 26, played 1 year. That was it. He was done. He just knew he didn't want to go on. And so if you want to make sure these students or children who want to play a professional sport, at least give them the opportunity to do so and actually enjoy it, teaching the proper way or alternating how you approach coaching is something to start at the youth level. So by the time they get to the professional league, they can enjoy it for a little bit longer than just 1 year because they're fearful of what could happen if they continue to play.
And then Annie, I'd like to ask you a similar question, not necessarily about football, but if similar measures can be taken in the game of soccer to make it safer and to reduce the risk for head injuries.
Definitely. So as was already discussed, we talked about like the header rule, the under 12 header rule that was passed in the UK. A similar one was actually passed in my area, like where I grew up playing soccer. So under 12, I believe youth athletes playing soccer can't head the ball. So I really think that this can extend one's career, as we were just talking about, and prevent head injuries at a younger level. Obviously, that doesn't mean that it's not a contact sport still and that concussions wouldn't happen. But I think that definitely could contribute to longer careers for soccer players, especially in their youth game. I know a lot of, especially goalkeepers, that were suffering many concussions from a young age, so many so that they had to quit the sport. So it is just, concussions are a big deal in women's soccer, especially, women are getting hit all the time. I think one thing they could potentially help prevention is just having open discussions about concussions and what causes them, as well as, potentially practicing neck strengthening exercises before games. I know that we do ACL prevention, and I'm sure that there are similar exercises we can do for concussion prevention, for strengthening neck, shoulders, all of that kind of stuff. And if we start implementing that at a younger age, people will start to realize the true impacts of concussions and honestly be better off for the future.
Yeah, and we actually have had a few more questions come in, so I'd like to keep you all for just a little bit longer. We do have until 2:30, which is great, so we can pick your brain a little bit more. I was wondering, I'm sorry, there's a question in the chat about what college athletes can do to help prevent concussions after they've sustained their first concussion to prevent brain injuries in the future. So is there anything that athletes can do after they've sustained their first concussion to reduce their risk? What do you think, Christian?
Allow yourself to fully recover from the first one. And then I would say continue to consult with your physician to make sure that you actually are medically cleared, because you can feel okay, maybe not show any physical symptoms, but I believe Sam mentioned that you can have some asymptomatic symptoms. So just making sure, appear asymptomatic, excuse me. So you just want to make sure that you are medically cleared to do so, and then maybe ease into the sport. Don't go back full throttle if you played a goalie in soccer, or if you played wide receiver in football, or did anything where there's a lot of contact. Maybe just start off with simple running, simple jogging, something light just to kind of ease yourself back in. But I would not recommend jumping back in immediately, just to make sure you have given yourself the proper time to be fully healed from the first injury you sustained.
Samantha?
Yeah, I think that's great advice. Always recommend working with your physician and making sure that you are ready to go back. And then you can just do the really simple, boring lifestyle things that we all know we should do. So make sure you're sleeping enough, you're drinking enough water, you're eating, a healthy diet. All these things will, pay you dividends in the back end. So the better your general health is, the better you'll be supported across your entire body, including your brain.
And then Annie, you really talked a lot about the mental health component, which is excellent. I'm just wondering if there's anything else that you would advise college athletes to do to take care of themselves after they've sustained concussions.
I think Sam and Christian pretty much covered it all. I think that's very similar advice that I would give college athletes after suffering a brain injury.
Yeah, it's solid advice for everybody, I think. And as far as, we've talked about several different levels of competitive sport and how different organizations and leagues are handling them. We have a question in the chat about club sports. So, the club teams in college operate independently of the NCAA and athletic departments. So how do we address these problems in club sports? Samantha?
I think it's a really tricky question in the sense that, unfortunately, the way the system is set up, the onus then kind of goes on to the club sport. What I would recommend is, if your school has an active recreation department, working with them to develop some sort of protocol that can be, used for the club sports, to have someone who's there to enforce it. Maybe see if you can get a contact at the athletic department to get your hands on their protocols so that you can be implementing it. But that is really where the coaches and the captains for the, the club sports have a much more important role, because they don't have that overarching governing body kind of mandating what they should do. But these athletes still have to go to school. They want to participate in their sport and do all their normal activities. So they should be able to get access to the same resources that the varsity athletes are getting.
Christian?
I agree with everything Sam said. I do feel like even if they're not playing on a national level, or they're not known throughout their school to be on the team, I still think they should still have access, because they're still playing a sport. And you really don't want the school to be liable for any type of injury that could have been prevented had they just extended their resources to their club level teams.
And then we have a couple more questions about just the rates of concussions among sports. I'm assuming that the majority of concussion research in sports is, football and other collision sports. Is there research that indicates that there's a higher rate of concussion or brain trauma in specific sports?
There's been a lot of accelerometer research that has been done that was really popular probably 5-6 years ago. People are still doing it, where they're actually putting, those sensors in helmets. But again, it's mostly in, your footballs. They've looked at it in soccer, where people had to wear headbands. But typically we're seeing sports again, like football, hockey, soccer, high rates of concussion, cheerleading, again, high rates just because it's a bit more of a risky sport in the sense that the tricks that they're doing, they're throwing people in the air. So most of those concussions are from, again, drops from those tricks or colliding. Whereas when you think about football is typically high in subconcussive impacts and concussion. Soccer is high in both because of heading, but something like hockey is high in more the concussion side of things because typically the impacts, again, are at greater speed. But if anyone wants to learn more, I'd encourage looking up some of that accelerometer data. There's great data from a few different groups around the world who are looking at different sports. But again, not every sport has been studied equally. So that's something to keep in mind when you are looking at the research.
Yeah, we definitely, talked about gender differences in concussion research. I'm wondering too, is there like a gap in research based on age, Christian, with your involvement in youth sports?
So I'm not sure about the age. It really comes down to more so the gender, simply because there's this fixation with male-dominated sports. And so even though women may perform better in the same sport as their male counterparts, there's not a lot of research on them to show, again, just how they handle and deal with concussions. But in terms of age, if there's anything, it seems to focus more so on the high school, if I'm recalling correctly, and like the college level, but that's pretty much the extent, just because getting the clearance to actually engage with children is a little bit difficult to do so because you do have a lot more that you have to consider, such as the risk that they may have from talking about it. They may not understand what you mean if you say head injury or concussion. And so it's difficult to determine just how much is missing simply because we can't directly talk to the youth or those that are like really young, like 5, 6, 7, because they may not understand and their parents may not have an understanding. But most of it is missing for the sports that are dominated by women, simply because that general societal interest around women's sports just isn't as large.
So I have another question for Annie. We have a question about the age of legal consent, and I wanted to sort of rephrase that because something that I talk a lot about in my research on like paternalism in college sports is this notion of consent in collegiate athletics. Like, are athletes really consenting to go back to play when they're injured or not feeling well? Like, is there a level of coercion in that? And I wanted to ask Annie just about some of the pressures that college athletes might feel that can get in the way of them taking proper concussion protocols and taking all the time off that they need.
Definitely. So when there's like a discussion about consent, we get all of this like paperwork at the beginning of the season. I'm sure you've experienced it yourself as a college athlete. You have to you're kind of signing away your rights as an athlete. You're kind of signing over to the NCAA, your governing body, to your school. You are a representative of your school, and you're almost a commodity or their property in some ways. So when you get injured, it is your responsibility to do everything you can to come back. It's your responsibility to come back for the purpose of your sport. That definitely adds a lot of pressure, I feel like, on the student athlete, because it is your responsibility to heal and to come back and to want to play again, to compete. And I think, that pressure can be really hard for people to grapple with, especially if their injury is so extreme that maybe they won't recover and ever play the same. That can be a really hard thing for a lot of people to accept after a serious injury. And I think as well, like alongside that, there's the pressures of playing time, wanting to get playing time again, and actually wanting to represent your school with minutes and getting stats. All of that as a collegiate athlete can be really important to your self-confidence, and also just knowing how you're performing and representing your school, and that pride can be essential as a student athlete. So I think there are pressures that come from a lot of different avenues on an injured student athlete on their recovery. And I think that importance placed on recovery should be an athlete-centric focus, a student athlete-centric focus. It should be more on, will this athlete be able to recover And if not, how can we support them? How can we support them in their process in getting back into school? How can we support them in their process to getting back to doing their everyday activities that they want to be doing? And I think, that's something that's definitely under discussed when we're talking about injured athletes is if they're not able to recover, how can we still continue to support them in their process?
Yeah, I remember all of the scholarship pressure to get back on the track as quickly as I possibly could. So definitely a systemic problem that definitely, impacts concussed athletes, but injured athletes in general, that is a huge, huge problem in the NCAA. And I appreciate that, more and more people are talking about that. And then finally, this actually will be our final question of the day, I promise. Thank you all so much for joining us again. Christian, I wanted to ask you, we have a question about if you had a son, would you let your son play football? And I think instead of asking that as a hypothetical, I'd like to ask, what do you think that parents should know about the risks of youth football and contact sports?
So I think that before a parent decides to put their child into a contact sport, it's really understanding the risk that come with it. And this is where advocates are doing their part to make sure parents understand, yes, you can play the sport. We're not saying don't. What we want you to understand is that there are risks, and these are some of the risks that you may have if your child decides to play. So I think finding or having that proper education is always going to be key. Making sure that if you as the parent of a child is uncertain as to what the rules of the game are, ask. If you don't know how they deal with or what their protocols are for dealing with injuries, regardless of if it's a sprained ankle or it's something as serious as a concussion, ask them what it is. You're allowing your child to play in the league, such as like the AYSO soccer league or any like youth baseball, softball, whatever league is, you're allowing your child to play. So the least that they can do for you is answer any questions that you have. So research the sport, research the league, kind of see if they have protocols in place. If they don't, ask them what they are. If you're concerned about whether or not they have medical staff on hand, ask them, will there be someone there to examine a child if they feel like they've been injured to an extent where they can't play? Is there a hospital nearby? Like, how do we handle these injuries to make sure if something comes up, medical treatment can be swift and we can reduce the amount of time that a child has to be in pain or that something else could go wrong or we can have a larger issue. So really just understanding that and holding the coaches, and the leagues accountable, but then just also making sure that as the parent, you do the research, as I said, because you also want to make sure you know what they're saying and not trying to just say what sounds good to appease you, but also being able to challenge what they tell you. So if you know the inner workings of a sport or what something should be and they're not mentioning it, speaking up about it. And then the one final thing I'll say is just encouraging your kids to use their voice. They have a voice. If they don't feel comfortable, if something doesn't feel right, tell them to speak up. If you teach them that there are no consequences to using your voice because you don't feel comfortable, they will feel much better speaking up. And honestly, it might have coaches and other administrative or coaching staff kind of understand we can't just do what we want. This is going to be the one that speaks up. So let's make sure we are honoring their voice and allowing them to use that agency and making sure that they understand we support whatever decision they make because we want this relationship to be mutually beneficial for us and for the athletes and the parents that we are going to have in our league for whatever amount of time that we have them.
Samantha, is there anything that you think that parents should know about concussion risks in their children?
Yeah, I think when you think about these sports, it's really understanding the long-term implications. And of course, again, concussion is a big issue and post-concussion is devastating, but thinking about the long-term health of your child, I don't know if we put enough onus on that. I think a lot of the pressure that we get and pushback we get with some of our campaigns is actually from parents. And of course, we want kids playing sports. Sports are great for so many different things, but you don't have to physically get knocked down to learn how to pick yourself back up. At least personally speaking, a lot of the lessons I learned in sport was not when I physically got rocked in hockey into the boards. It was losing those tough games where you played your best and you still lost, or when you didn't play your best at all and your team had to then go skate for 2 hours without pucks. These hard lessons that you learn without actually having to physically be hit. And I think we have such an attachment to hitting in some of these sports because we feel it's the hitting that teaches these lessons. But when you think about, again, I'm a neurodegenerative disease expert. Of course, this is my lens, but the risk that you have of developing CTE is increasingly high when you play, every extra year you add onto the career, it gets higher. So looking at reducing your child's risk, most children do not play sports beyond high school. So if they are not starting hitting until high school, that means their exposure is going to be 4 years. So if you can do that, we can reduce, 90+% of CTE cases if everyone was not hitting or tackling or doing headers until the age of 14. And then those who do go on to play at the college or the professional level, hopefully have extended careers. But I mean, Aaron Hernandez was 27. He had stage 3 CTE. Of course, this is very rare. But if we just think about Alzheimer's, for example, it would be devastating to learn that your child at 27 had stage 3 of 4 Alzheimer's. So it should be devastating to think that your child may get a neurodegenerative disease in their late 20s. It's very abnormal. And CTE is a very preventable disease. We do not know how to prevent Parkinson's. We do not know how to prevent Alzheimer's, but we know how to prevent CTE. And your child can still be an athlete and play all these wonderful sports and not have the risk of getting this disease or have a very reduced risk. So it's just something to think about. Like, I know we love to watch our kids play, but like them hitting each other is not the bulk of the lesson learning in the sport. Like, there's so many lessons that can be learned if you pull those components of the sport out when they're a child.
And then Annie, from the perspective of a college athlete, what do you think that parents should know about their athletes' risks of concussions and brain injuries?
I think that discussions between parents and children about their willingness to compete in a sport that has these risks are essential, especially as their child continues to grow up and wants to continue to compete in sports. I know those conversations happen all the time in my household. We, all 3 girls of us, like, we all were playing sports that were high contact. We were all getting injured constantly. If we didn't love the sport, we would have probably just ended up quitting. These conversations to have with your children who are engaged in these athletics are essential. And if they start at a younger age, then kids will know that they can come to their parents with pretty much anything regarding their injuries and regarding their feelings about these risks. I think, like, the only thing you can really do is educate both parents and children on the risks. And as long as there's an awareness of what kids are getting themselves into, I think that, that's pretty much all we can do. We can advocate for all of these public statements about concussions and all the protocol. And if we continue to do that and have the discussions at home, I think children will be much better off in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all so much for all the information that you shared today. We covered everything from, what is a concussion, what is CTE, the importance of education and advocacy, some personal experiences with head injuries and concussions and the ramifications of them. And we had some great expertise on this panel. Are there any final thoughts, anything that we didn't? I know we covered a lot of ground, but is there anything that we didn't get to today that anyone would like to end on? No, I think we covered it all. All right. Well, once again, thank you so much to our panelists for coming out today, to Annie Welch, to Dr. Christian Dotson-Pearson, and to Dr. Samantha Bureau. On behalf of the Drake Group, I'd like to once again thank everybody for coming out today. Thank you so much for Two-A-Days for helping us to put on these webinars, and again for the University of Texas Center for Sport Media and Communication for providing the space today. I'd also like to encourage everyone to come out to our next webinar on Thursday, November 17th from 2 to 3:30 p.m. Eastern. We are going to be talking about the topic of students, employees, or both in college sports. Lots of stuff about the educational model of college sports, unionization, employee status, a lot of hot topics that have been in the news for those of us who've been following the college sports reform conversation. Thank you all once again, and have a great rest of your day.